There's something psychologically potent about silence, especially when it comes after emotional harm. We tend to think of silence as nothing, as absence, but in reality, silence is full, it's dense. It's a presence in its own right. And when you've been hurt, mistreated, dismissed, or emotionally manipulated, silence can become one of the most confronting forces in the dynamic. Not for you, but for him. Here's why. When you stop responding, when you stop defending yourself, when you stop trying to make him understand what he's done, what you're really doing is removing the mirror he used to avoid looking at himself. Because as long as you're talking, as long as you're reacting, he has somewhere to direct the focus. He can blame you for being emotional. He can twist your words. He can make the argument about your reaction instead of his action. That's a deflection strategy, and it's remarkably common in manipulative dynamics. It protects the ego by redirecting discomfort away from the self. But when you go silent, that strategy collapses. There's no more external stimulus to latch onto, no more reaction to manipulate, no more emotional labor coming from you that he can hijack to avoid his own self-examination. In that moment, he's left alone, not just physically, but psychologically. And that solitude is louder than anything you could have said. Now, let's take that a step deeper. From a psychological standpoint, silence activates a phenomenon known as internal projection. When someone is met with ambiguity, especially after being the cause of relational harm, they begin to fill in the blanks with their own subconscious fears, guilt, and unresolved shame. That's what happens when the person you hurt goes quiet. The silence acts like a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum. So the mind rushes to fill it with doubt, with anxiety, with questions like, did I go too far? Or is she done with me? Or worse, why doesn't she even care enough to fight? These questions become tormenting precisely because they have no immediate answer. You've removed yourself from the conversation, and in doing so, you've handed him the most unfiltered experience of consequence possible, his own uninterrupted thoughts. For many men, especially those who have used charm, impulsiveness, or emotional detachment as defense mechanisms, this kind of mirror is intolerable. They've built their sense of identity around external control. But your silence dismantles that. It places the burden of interpretation back on them. And it's in that quiet, solitary space that real psychological suffering begins. This is not about revenge. It's about realignment. You're not punishing him. You're stopping the cycle that kept both of you in a loop of dysfunction. You're not giving him more of yourself just so he can continue to avoid himself. Instead, you're stepping out. You're refusing to participate in his avoidance. And that's what forces him to confront what he's actually done. Because the truth is, silence is not void, it's a boundary. And for someone who has taken your presence for granted, your silence becomes the first real indicator that something has fundamentally shifted. It's not drama, it's not manipulation, it's the clean break between tolerance and self-respect. And he feels that, not in the noise, but in the space you leave behind. There's something rarely discussed but deeply important when we talk about human conflict, especially in intimate relationships, and that is the function of emotional reaction in power dynamics. See, when someone hurts you, particularly someone close, what they often count on isn't your silence, it's your response, your anger, your heartbreak, your confrontation. Why? Because those reactions become predictable, they become manageable, and most critically, they become controllable. When you react, you enter their frame. You allow the person who wronged you to set the tempo of the interaction. Even if you're right, even if your words are cutting and true, the emotional response itself becomes a resource they can use against you. That doesn't mean your anger is invalid. It simply means it's expected. And expected behaviors lose power over time, especially in the hands of someone who knows how to use your emotions as leverage. They push your buttons. they provoke you, and then they sit back and call you too emotional, crazy, overreacting, and suddenly you find yourself defending your tone instead of the truth. Now contrast that with silence, real, grounded, non-reactive silence. When you withhold your response, not out of fear, not out of helplessness, but out of clarity and self-possession, you break the psychological rhythm. And that disruption is powerful because the person who is relying on your emotional output to maintain their control is now left with nothing to grasp, no energy to feed off, no drama to direct. They become emotionally disarmed. From a psychological perspective, this is deeply destabilizing. Humans are pattern recognizing machines. We survive by predicting the behavior of others. When those predictions fail, when the response doesn't come as expected, the brain enters a heightened state of uncertainty. This state is uncomfortable, even painful, especially for someone who has built their sense of relational control around your predictability. Your silence is not just a void, it's a disruption of a psychological system that he has grown used to manipulating. Philosophically, this idea ties into the concept of logos, the power of meaningful speech. But here's the twist. Sometimes meaning is best conveyed not by what is said, but by what is withheld. In refusing to participate in the cycle, in removing your words from the dynamic, you create a pause. And in that pause, everything unsettles. You've stripped away the surface noise and revealed the lack of substance underneath. You are no longer fueling his delusions. You are no longer volunteering for his script. This kind of silence is not weakness, it's restraint. It requires a disciplined mind. It takes emotional maturity to hold back when every part of you wants to explode, to be heard, to be understood. But when you step back instead of stepping in, you make him sit with his own words, his own behaviors, and his own discomfort. That's when suffering begins, not because you intended to hurt him, but because you stopped helping him escape himself. And the more you maintain that silence, the more it begins to speak louder than anything you could have shouted. He doesn't hear your voice, but he hears your absence. He doesn't feel your anger, but he feels your detachment. And that detachment, over time, unravels the illusion of control he thought he had. You're not confusing him to be cruel. You're stepping out of a manipulative system to reclaim clarity. And that very act rewrites the emotional script, not just for him, but for you. There's a strange misconception that silence is the safe option, that if you don't speak up, you're protecting the peace. But what often gets overlooked is that silence isn't inert. It's not neutral. It's not some passive force floating in the background. Silence is active. It forms habits, and those habits shape your psychological structure over time, especially when it comes to your boundaries. See, when you stay silent once, maybe because you don't want to start an argument or you don't feel strong enough to explain your pain, it feels like a small choice, a single moment of restraint. But when you do it again and again and again, that restraint becomes a pattern. And patterns are the building blocks of character, not in the sense of morality, but in the sense of identity. Who you are, what you tolerate, what you expect, all of that is shaped by what you repeatedly allow. Now think about that in the context of emotional harm. When someone crosses a line and you say nothing, you're not just sparing yourself a confrontation, you're slowly erasing that line, not for them, for you. The boundary starts to fade because silence, over time, distorts your internal map of what's acceptable and what isn't. And once your own sense of violation becomes vague, you stop defending it, not because you want to be hurt, but because you've grown unfamiliar with the feeling of being safe. It's a psychological erosion, a quiet one, and the danger is that it's easy to miss. You'll tell yourself you're being calm, that you're being the bigger person, that it's not worth the fight. But the real cost comes later in the form of chronic resentment, emotional numbness, or worse, loss of self-respect. And here's the thing, the person who's hurting you, they're watching. Maybe not consciously, but they're observing what you permit, what you respond to, what you endure. And if every offense is met with silence, they don't see humility, they see permission. And this isn't about blaming yourself for someone else's behavior. That's not the point. The point is to recognize that silence isn't just about them. It's about you. Every time you choose not to speak up when something violates your values, you're training your nervous system to accept discomfort as normal. And once that becomes your baseline, it gets harder and harder to find your voice when it really matters. There's also a broader philosophical dimension to this. A life without boundaries is a life lived in submission, not to authority, but to chaos. Boundaries are what separate order from disorder. They're what allow you to orient yourself in the world and say, here is where I end and the other begins. When you stop enforcing those lines, when silence becomes your default mode of self-preservation, you blur that distinction. You lose the sharpness of your identity, and with it your power. Ironically, the silence that you think is keeping things calm is often the very thing prolonging the harm. Because it doesn't disrupt the system, it stabilizes it. It makes dysfunction comfortable for the other person. They don't have to change because your silence tells them nothing's wrong. They're not suffering, but you are. And the longer you stay silent, the more you absorb the emotional cost of their behavior while they remain emotionally insulated from the consequences. So if you want the dynamic to shift, it starts with reclaiming the integrity of your voice, not for vengeance, not even for justice, but for your own psychological survival. Because in the end, what you allow will continue, and what you silence will shape you. We often misunderstand silence as weakness, as if not responding means surrendering power, but the truth is far more complex and far more important. Silence, when grounded in self-awareness, isn't the absence of power. It's the withdrawal of it. It's an intentional choice to stop giving your energy, your attention, and your emotional labor to someone who has misused it. And that withdrawal, paradoxically, is what makes silence one of the most commanding responses available to you. See, in any relational dynamic, especially in conflict, attention is currency. Every look, every word, every reaction, you're spending something. You're offering a piece of your presence. And the more emotionally invested you are, the more valuable that presence becomes. When someone hurts you and you continue engaging, arguing, explaining, pleading, you're still giving. You're still offering yourself, even through the pain. And in some twisted sense, they still benefit from that. Your presence says, I still care enough to show up even in suffering. But when you become silent, not in fear, but in conviction, something shifts. You're no longer standing in that emotional arena. You're stepping out of it. You're refusing to donate your energy to someone who's proven they don't know how to handle it. And that sends a message louder than any accusation ever could. You no longer have access to me. That kind of silence is powerful because it breaks the illusion of entitlement. Many men, particularly those who operate with emotional immaturity or narcissistic tendencies, assume that your emotional availability is a given. They take your responsiveness for granted. They expect you to show up angry or loving. It doesn't matter, because your presence, even in conflict, reassures them that they still hold a place in your life. But when that presence disappears, when your voice no longer fills the space they once dominated, what they're left with is absence. And absence to the entitled mind is unbearable. Psychologically, this withdrawal forces a reevaluation. The human mind is loss averse. We're wired to respond more strongly to loss than to gain. When you go silent, you're not just denying him conversation. You're denying him the illusion of control. You're removing the mirror he used to regulate his self-hatred. And without that external validation, he's left to face himself without your emotional scaffolding to hold him up. This is why silence can feel so threatening to those who depend on dominance to feel secure, because dominance thrives on reaction. It needs someone to push against. It feeds on emotional friction. But when you disengage, not with malice, but with clarity, you cut off that supply. You stop being a participant in the very dynamic that's been draining you. And in doing so, you become something entirely unexpected in his psychological landscape, unpredictable. And unpredictability in this context is terrifying because it signals that you've changed the rules. You're no longer the same person who once tolerated the mistreatment. You've evolved beyond the cycle. And once he realizes he can no longer provoke guilt or charm you back into it, what he feels isn't just confusion, it's loss. And that's when he suffers. Not because you intended harm, but because you finally refuse to carry the emotional burden for both of you. So silence isn't weakness, it's strength disciplined by wisdom. It's the quiet confidence of knowing your worth and choosing not to debate it anymore. It's not about withholding love, it's about refusing to bleed for someone who never learned how to stop cutting it. What many people fail to grasp is that silence doesn't just affect the person receiving it, it fundamentally reshapes the person practicing it. Transformation isn't always gentle, it's uncomfortable, because when you stop speaking into the dysfunction, you're no longer only withdrawing from him, you're confronting yourself. You're sitting alone with everything you've tried to manage, excuse, and explain. And that stillness forces you to ask questions that are far more difficult than any argument you could have had with him. Questions like, why did I allow this to go on for so long? Why did I trade my peace for his validation? What was I so afraid of losing that I tolerated being diminished? These questions don't come with easy answers. They come with introspection, with grief, and often with the painful realization that silence, though powerful, doesn't immediately make things better. It makes things clearer, and clarity, while essential, can be brutal. But that's where the growth lives, because silence, when it's rooted in intentional withdrawal, not passive suppression, becomes a sacred space for reconstruction. You're no longer investing in managing his behavior. You're redirecting that energy inward toward your own healing, your own truth, your own values. And this is where things begin to shift in a fundamental way, not just in the dynamic between you and him, but in the relationship you have with yourself. See, people often think that power comes from getting the last word, from proving your point, from changing someone else's mind. But real power, sustainable, rooted power, comes from self-governance, from knowing where your responsibility begins and ends. And silence teaches you that boundary. It becomes the mirror in which you see, sometimes for the first time, the emotional labor you were doing on behalf of someone else's growth. Labor they never asked for and never truly valued. When you stop filling the space with explanations and justifications, what you're left with is the stark outline of reality. You start to see how much you were accommodating dysfunction just to avoid discomfort. You start to realize that silence is not just a punishment to him, it's a revelation to you. It shows you where your energy was going, what it was costing you, and who you were becoming in the process. You're not trying to win anymore, you're trying to be well. And silence, when aligned with intention, is one of the most direct paths to wellness. It teaches you detachment without bitterness. It teaches you strength without aggression. It teaches you how to preserve your dignity without having to perform it. So yes, he may suffer in your silence, but you evolve, you remember yourself, you rebuild the parts that got eroded in the process of keeping the peace. And what emerges is not someone colder or more closed off, but someone clearer, someone who no longer needs chaos to feel significant, someone who no longer equates suffering with love. There's a profound psychological shift that occurs when a person no longer has access to your emotional availability. It's not just that they notice your silence, it's that they begin to feel the weight of what your presence once carried. And if they were drawing strength, identity, or validation from your responsiveness, its sudden absence becomes deeply disorienting. This is particularly true in relationships where emotional imbalance has been normalized, where one person overextends and the other indulges in that extension without reciprocating. When you go silent, not from avoidance, but from self-possession, you interrupt that dynamic. You remove the feedback loop they've come to rely on. Think of it like this. If someone constantly tests the boundary of your emotional tolerance and you keep responding, whether in anger, pain, or even compassion, you're still anchoring them. You're stabilizing their behavior by giving it form and meaning. But when you stop responding altogether, the structure collapses. Not because you destroyed it, but because your participation was the only thing keeping it upright in the first place. This collapse triggers discomfort in the other person, not because they suddenly understand the harm they've caused, but because they can no longer make sense of their place in your world. It's not your job to make them comfortable in their dysfunction, but your silence forces them to confront the emotional consequences of their actions without your help filtering, softening, or translating it. And this confrontation can be agonizing, especially for someone who's built their self-concept on control, power, or your emotional labor. Here's where it gets interesting from a psychological perspective. People who are emotionally underdeveloped often depend on external conflict or validation to stabilize their inner world. They need the reaction. They need to feel important, even if it's through chaos. Your silence strips them of that role. It removes them from the center of your emotional experience. And that's what really hurts. It's not punishment, it's displacement. You are no longer orbiting around them, and suddenly they're forced to face their own gravity, unaided. But there's another layer to this, one that concerns your long-term growth. Because when you stop being the emotional caregiver for someone who continually drains you, you create space to reoccupy yourself. You begin to understand that your voice was never just for setting boundaries, it was for directing your life. Your silence isn't the end of something, it's the beginning of authority, not over others, but over yourself. That's where the deeper transformation happens. You stop needing closure from them. You stop hoping they'll finally understand. You stop living in reaction to what they do or fail to do. Your silence becomes a signal, not to them, but to yourself, that you are no longer available for dynamics that demand you diminish in order to survive. And eventually they feel that, not because you've explained it, but because they can no longer ignore the void your absence creates. This isn't about revenge. It's not about making them suffer. It's about reclaiming your role as the author of your own emotional reality. You are no longer a character in their chaos. You've exited the stage and taken the script with you. So while the silence may cause them pain, the point is not their suffering. The point is your return to your values, to your standards, to your peace. And that peace, when cultivated deeply enough, becomes untouchable. Not because you've become hard, but because you've become whole.